Welcome to our deep dive into On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder. This book is kind of like a survival guide for democracy. It uses 20 lessons from 20th century Europe to help us spot warning signs. Warning signs of rising authoritarianism, even here in the US. I gotta admit, reading it kind of gave me chills
For sure.
because some of the parallels to our current political climate are pretty unsettling.
What's fascinating is that Snyder doesn't just present these lessons as abstract theories. He connects them to real people who lived through Nazi and Soviet regimes.
Mhm.
Their stories, their choices, their acts of courage and complicity. It makes the book incredibly impactful because it shows how these seemingly distant historical events have direct relevance to our lives today.
So are you saying that even though we're living in a very different time and place, the patterns of tyranny can still emerge, even in a supposedly stable democracy like ours?
Absolutely. And that's why Snyder's book is so timely. It's not about predicting the future, but about recognizing those patterns and giving us a framework for critical thinking, for asking ourselves, what can we learn from the past to safeguard our freedoms in the present?
Okay, let's dive into some of those lessons. The book starts with the slippery slope to tyranny, and the very first lesson is do not obey in advance. This one really got me thinking because it's so subtle yet so powerful.
Right. It's about recognizing that authoritarianism doesn't always arrive with a bang. It often creeps in gradually through seemingly small acts of compliance, where people start anticipating what they think the government wants and adjust their behavior accordingly, even before any explicit demands are made.
It reminds me of that famous Milgram experiment, where ordinary people were willing to administer what they believed were painful electric shocks, just because a scientist in a lab coat told them to. It's terrifying to think how easily we can be manipulated by authority figures.
Exactly. And Snyder argues that this anticipatory obedience is precisely how tyrants gain a foothold. Think about the Austrians in 1938, who started looting Jewish shops and denouncing their Jewish neighbors, even before the Nazis explicitly ordered them to do so. It's a chilling reminder that tyranny often begins with the complicity of ordinary citizens.
So what's the antidote? How do we resist this tendency to obey in advance?
That's where the next lesson comes in. Defend institutions. Snyder argues that a robust democracy relies on strong institutions. Courts of free press, universities, professional organizations. They act as checks and balances on power, ensuring that no single entity can become too dominant.
But don't these institutions often feel slow, bureaucratic, and out of touch with the needs of everyday people?
That's a fair point. And it's exactly why tyrants often target these institutions first, portraying them as inefficient or even corrupt. They try to erode public trust in these vital pillars of democracy. But we can't fall for that trap. We need to actively defend and participate in these institutions.
So what does that look like in practice?
It can be as simple as subscribing to a local newspaper, attending a town hall meeting, or volunteering with a legal aid organization. It's about making our voices heard, holding our elected officials accountable, and ensuring that these institutions continue to function as they should.
Makes sense. So we need to be wary of anticipatory obedience and actively defend our institutions. What else should we be on the lookout for?
Lesson 3 is beware the one-party state. This is a big one, especially in the US, where we have a two-party system. That can sometimes feel more like a zero-sum game than a genuine dialogue.
You're saying that even in a two-party system, the danger of a one-party state can still exist.
Yes, it's not just about the number of parties, it's about the concentration of power. When a single party gains too much control, it can manipulate the rules of the game to silence opposition and consolidate its grip on power.
That sounds eerily familiar to some of the political rhetoric we're hearing these days.
Exactly. We need to be vigilant about any attempts to undermine free and fair elections, suppress dissenting voices, or erode the independence of the judiciary. These are all warning signs that a one-party state might be emerging, even in a democracy that appears to be functioning on the surface.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, it's not enough to just vote in elections. We need to be actively engaged in the political process, holding our elected officials accountable, and defending the institutions that protect our democracy. But where does our personal responsibility come into all of this?
That's where lesson 4 comes in. Take responsibility for the face of the world. It's about recognizing that even our everyday actions, our choices, our words, and even our silences contribute to the kind of world we create.
That sounds like a huge burden to carry. What does that actually look like in our daily lives?
Think about the visual propaganda used in Nazi Germany to dehumanize Jews, or the way Stalin's regime demonized prosperous farmers as enemies of the people. They used language and imagery to create a climate of fear and division. that makes it easier to justify violence and oppression.
So are you suggesting that even seemingly harmless symbols or trends today could contribute to a dangerous normalization of harmful ideologies?
It's a question we all need to grapple with. Are there ways in which we might be unconsciously contributing to a culture of intolerance, fear, or apathy? Are we calling out injustice when we see it? Are we engaging in respectful dialogue with those who hold different views? These are the kinds of questions Snyder's book challenges us to confront.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. So far, we've covered the first four lessons, which are do not obey in advance, defend institutions, beware the one-party state, take responsibility for the face of the world, and it sounds like there's a lot more to unpack in this book.
Absolutely. And each lesson builds on the previous one, creating a framework for understanding how tyranny emerges and how we can resist it.
All right, so let's keep going. Lesson 5 is remember professional ethics.
This is about recognizing that professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, journalists, have a special responsibility to uphold ethical standards and resist the pressure to conform to authoritarian demands.
It's about using their expertise to serve the public good, not the interests of a tyrannical regime, right?
Precisely. Think about the doctors who refused to participate in Nazi medical experiments, or the lawyers who defended those accused of crimes against the state. They understood that their professional ethics transcended the demands of any political authority.
That takes incredible courage and integrity. Okay, so lesson 6 is be wary of paramilitaries. What are paramilitaries exactly?
Paramilitaries are armed groups that operate outside the official military and police forces. They're often used by authoritarian regimes to intimidate opponents, enforce their will, and create a climate of fear.
I'm trying to wrap my head around how this connects to our current situation. Are you referring to private militias or extremist groups?
It's certainly something to consider. The presence of armed groups operating outside the law is a sign of a weakening democracy and a potential harbinger of violence.
That's a pretty chilling thought. And lesson 7 is be reflective if you must be armed. What does this mean?
It's about recognizing the immense responsibility that comes with owning a firearm and understanding the potential consequences of using it. It's about being aware of the historical context of armed conflict and how easily violence can escalate, especially in a society where fear and mistrust are rampant.
It's not a pro-gun or anti-gun statement. It's about urging us to be thoughtful, responsible citizens if we choose to be armed.
Exactly. It's about understanding that the right to bear arms comes with a profound moral obligation.
That's a powerful message. All right, before we move on, I just want to recap the lessons we've covered so far.
Certainly, we have. Do not obey in advance. Defend institutions. Beware the one-party state. Take responsibility for the face of the world. Remember professional ethics. Be wary of paramilitaries. Be reflective if you must be armed.
These first 7 lessons have really set the stage for understanding the early warning signs of tyranny, haven't they?
They have. They highlight the subtle ways in which authoritarianism can emerge, often masquerading as patriotism, security, or even progress.
And they underscore the crucial role that ordinary citizens play in either resisting or enabling this slide into tyranny.
Precisely. It's a reminder that democracy is fragile, that it requires constant vigilance and active participation from all of us. So we've discussed the importance of recognizing the early signs of tyranny. But what can we do as individuals to resist the pull toward authoritarianism? That's where the next set of lessons comes in.
I'm all ears because these first 7 lessons have really got me thinking. It's scary how subtle the signs can be, and I'm realizing how important it is to be aware and engaged.
Lesson 8 is stand out. It's about having the courage to be different, to speak up even when it's unpopular, to resist the pressure to conform.
This makes me think of people like Winston Churchill, who stood up to Hitler when many others were willing to appease him, or Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. These were acts of defiance that sparked movements and changed the course of history.
Yes. And while those are grand examples, Snyder emphasizes that courage often takes much quieter forms. Think about the countless individuals who risked their lives to hide Jews during the Holocaust, or the dissidents who spoke out against communist regimes, even though it meant imprisonment or worse.
So standing out doesn't always mean being a public hero. It can be about making small, personal choices that uphold our values.
Absolutely. It can be about refusing to participate in gossip or bullying, speaking up for someone who's being marginalized, or simply refusing to go along with the crowd when you know something is wrong.
This leads nicely into lesson 9, be kind to our language. How does being kind to language relate to resisting tyranny?
Snyder argues that totalitarian regimes manipulate language to control thought. They twist meanings, demonize opponents, and create a climate of fear and suspicion where critical thinking is suppressed.
And this reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the constant barrage of information we face today, especially online. It can be hard to distinguish truth from falsehood. And it often feels like we're being manipulated by algorithms and outrage-driven headlines.
Exactly. And this constant exposure to manipulative language can erode our ability to think clearly, to engage in nuanced discussions, to even recognize truth when we see it.
So being kind to our language is not just about being polite. It's about being mindful of the words we use, seeking out diverse perspectives, and being wary of those who try to manipulate us with simplistic slogans or emotionally charged.
Yes, about cultivating a love of language, recognizing its power to both illuminate and deceive, and using it to promote understanding and critical thinking, even in the face of overwhelming noise and manipulation.
That's such a powerful way to think about language, and it connects directly to Lesson 10, which is believe in truth. This might seem obvious, but it's become a radical concept in our post-truth world.
It's alarming how quickly facts have become subject to interpretation, often shaped by political agendas or social media algorithms. And this erosion of truth is exactly what authoritarians exploit.
Snyder draws a chilling parallel to the rise of Nazism, where propaganda and misinformation were used to create an alternate reality, where people were encouraged to believe whatever the regime told them, regardless of the evidence.
He uses the example of Eugene Ionesco's play Rhinoceros, where people gradually transform into beasts by accepting absurd propaganda as truth. It's a powerful metaphor for how we can lose our humanity, our individuality, when we abandon our commitment to truth.
So what can we do to combat this trend? How do we reclaim truth in a world that seems increasingly hostile to facts?
Snyder's answer is simple yet challenging. Investigate. That's lesson 11. Don't just accept what you're told, even from sources you trust. Dig deeper. Check multiple sources. Be skeptical, ask questions. And be willing to change your mind when presented with new evidence.
This is where investigative journalism comes in, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Snyder highlights the importance of supporting quality journalism that is committed to truth-seeking, fact-checking, and holding those in power accountable.
So this is a call to be more discerning about the sources we consume, to be wary of echo chambers and filter bubbles, and to actively seek out diverse perspectives.
Exactly. And it's also a reminder that truth is not something we passively receive. It's something we actively pursue and defend.
So we've talked about resisting tyranny by standing out, being kind to language, believing in truth, and investigating. These all seem like individual actions. But what about collective action? How do we work together to resist authoritarianism?
Lesson 12 offers a surprisingly simple yet profound suggestion. Make eye contact and small talk.
You're saying that something as simple as making eye contact and small talk can help us resist tyranny.
It might seem trivial, but think about it. Authoritarian regimes thrive on atomizing society, isolating individuals, and sowing mistrust among neighbors. By engaging in these small acts of connection, we're reaffirming our shared humanity, building social trust, and creating a sense of community that can act as a bulwark against tyranny.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together, that we need each other, and that we're stronger together than we are alone.
Exactly. And it's about breaking down the barriers that authoritarians try to erect between us.
So making eye contact and small talk are not just about being polite, they're acts of resistance. I love that. What's next?
Lesson 13 builds on this idea of connection. Practice corporeal politics.
What does corporeal politics even mean? It sounds very academic.
It simply means getting out of our online bubbles and engaging in the real world, in physical spaces, with other human beings. It's about recognizing that real change requires physical presence, building relationships, and taking collective action in the streets, not just on our screens.
This reminds me of the incredible story of the Solidarity movement in Poland, where millions of people came together in protests, strikes, and underground meetings to challenge communist rule.
Exactly. They understood that real power lies not in virtual likes and shares, but in the collective energy of people coming together in physical space to demand change.
So it's a call to attend rallies, join protests, volunteer in our communities, and be physically present in the spaces where decisions are being made.
Yes, it's about reclaiming public space, demonstrating our collective power, and reminding those in power that they are accountable to the people.
Powerful stuff. Okay, lesson 14 is establish a private life. This one seems a bit out of place. How does having a private life relate to resisting tyranny?
It's about recognizing that authoritarian regimes thrive on surveillance, on collecting information about their citizens, on controlling the narrative, and suppressing dissent. By cultivating a private life, Spaces where we can think freely, connect with others without fear of reprisal, and nurture our individuality. We are creating a sanctuary for dissent.
And this feels especially relevant in our digital age, where our every move, every click, every purchase is tracked and analyzed.
Precisely. Snyder warns that this constant surveillance can have a chilling effect on our freedom of expression, our willingness to take risks, and our ability to think critically and independently.
So establishing a private life is not just about protecting our personal information. It's about protecting our minds, our souls, our ability to be free-thinking individuals.
Exactly. It's about creating spaces where we can resist the constant pressure to conform, to perform, to present a curated version of ourselves to the world.
That's so important in a world where we're constantly bombarded with messages, telling us who we should be, what we should buy, and how we should think.
It's about reclaiming our autonomy, our individuality, our right to be ourselves, even if that self is messy, imperfect, and constantly evolving.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. All right, so we've covered lessons 8 through 14. What stands out to you from this set of lessons?
For me, it's the emphasis on the power of individual action, even in the face of overwhelming forces. Snyder reminds us that even small acts of courage, kindness, and truth-seeking can have a ripple effect, inspiring others and contributing to a more just and humane world.
I agree. It's a reminder that we are not powerless, that we have choices, and that our choices matter. So we've talked about recognizing the signs of tyranny and building individual resilience, but how do we translate that into collective action? Where do we go from here?
That's where the remaining lessons in On Tyranny come in. They offer a roadmap for moving from awareness to action, for building a more robust and resilient democracy.
All right, let's hear it. Lesson 15 is contribute to good causes. How does this tie into resisting tyranny?
Authoritarian regimes thrive on fear, isolation, and the breakdown of social trust by contributing to good causes. Whether it's volunteering at a local soup kitchen, donating to a human rights organization, or simply supporting your local library, you're strengthening the fabric of civil society, fostering a sense of community, and building networks of support that can act as a bulwark against tyranny.
So it's not just about giving back to our communities. It's about investing in the kind of world we want to live in, a world where people feel connected, supported, and empowered.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that even seemingly apolitical organizations can play a vital role in defending democracy.
What about lesson 16? Learn from peers in other countries.
This is a crucial one. It's about recognizing that the struggle against tyranny is not confined to any one nation or region. It's a global fight. And we can learn from the experiences, strategies, and successes of others who have faced similar challenges.
So this is about looking beyond our own borders, connecting with activists and organizations in other countries, sharing knowledge and resources, and building a global movement for democracy.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing our shared humanity and understanding that the fate of democracy anywhere is intertwined with the fate of democracy everywhere.
This really resonates with me because it feels like we're living in an increasingly interconnected world, where events in one country can have ripple effects across the globe.
Exactly. And that means our responsibility extends beyond our national borders. We have a moral obligation to support those who are fighting for freedom and democracy, wherever they may be.
That's a powerful reminder. Okay, moving on to lesson 17. Listen for dangerous words. What are some of those dangerous words we should be listening for?
Snyder highlights words like extremism, terrorism, and national security, which can be easily manipulated to justify the erosion of civil liberties, the suppression of dissent, and the concentration of power in the hands of the few.
So it's not about ignoring these issues, but about being critical of how these terms are used, who benefits from their use, and what impact they have on our freedoms.
Exactly. It's about being aware of the historical context of these words, how they've been used to justify oppression and violence in the past, and how they're being used today to shape public opinion and limit debate.
And how does this relate to lesson 18, be calm when the unthinkable arrives?
It's about recognizing that authoritarians often exploit moments of crisis, terrorist attacks, economic downturns, natural disasters, to consolidate their power. They use fear and chaos to justify extreme measures, often suspending civil liberties, silencing opposition, and demonizing anyone who questions their authority.
This reminds me of how the Nazis used the Reichstag fire, a suspected arson attack on the German parliament building, to justify the suspension of civil liberties and the consolidation of Hitler's power.
Exactly. And we've seen similar tactics used in more recent times, often in the name of fighting terrorism or protecting national security.
So Snyder's message is don't panic, don't give in to fear, and don't surrender your freedoms in the name of security. It's a reminder that the most important time to defend our democracy is when it seems most vulnerable.
Absolutely. It's about remaining calm, critical, and engaged. Even in the face of fear and uncertainty, it's about remembering our values, upholding the rule of law, and
Yeah.
holding those in power accountable, even in times of crisis.
These last few lessons have really driven home the point that resisting tyranny is not just about individual actions. It's about collective responsibility.
Yeah.
It's about building a culture of vigilance. And it's about actively defending the institutions that protect our freedoms.
Yes. And it's a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires constant participation, vigilance, and courage from all of us.
So how do we cultivate that courage? That willingness to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's difficult, even when it feels like we're standing alone.
That's where the final two lessons come in. Be a patriot and be as courageous as you can.
So what does it mean to be a patriot in the context of resisting tyranny?
Snyder makes a clear distinction between patriotism and nationalism. Nationalism, he argues, is about blind allegiance,
Hmm?
about glorifying the nation at the expense of truth and justice. It's about exclusion, about us versus them. And it often leads to intolerance, violence, and oppression.
And patriotism, in contrast, is about love of one's country, but it's a love that is grounded in principles and ideals, in a commitment to justice and equality for all.
Exactly. It's about holding our nation to its highest aspirations, about recognizing its flaws and working to make it better, about defending its democratic values against those who would seek to erode them.
So it's not about waving flags or chanting slogans. It's about engaging in the messy, challenging work of building a more just and equitable society for all.
Absolutely. And that requires courage. Which brings us to the final lesson. Be as courageous as you can.
This feels like a call to action, a reminder that we all have a role to play in resisting tyranny.
Yes, Snyder argues that the choice between resisting tyranny and succumbing to it is not a matter of historical inevitability. It's a choice we make every day, in our words, our actions, our silences, and our willingness to stand up for what we believe in.
So it's not about being fearless. It's about recognizing our fear and choosing to act despite it.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that even small acts of courage can have a ripple effect, inspiring others and contributing to a more just and humane world.
As we wrap up this deep dive into On Tyranny, I'm struck by the book's timeliness and relevance to our current political climate. What are your final takeaways?
For me, it's the reminder that democracy is fragile, that it requires constant vigilance and active participation from all of us. It's not something we can take for granted. It's something we must actively defend, nurture, and fight for.
And it's a reminder that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does offer us valuable lessons, warnings, and inspirations. By understanding the patterns of tyranny, we can equip ourselves to recognize and resist them in our own time.
Exactly. On Tyranny is not just a book about the past. It's a guidebook for the present, a call to action, and a reminder that the fate of democracy rests in our hands.
This deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking and frankly a bit unsettling. I encourage you to read On Tyranny for yourself and to reflect on how these lessons might apply to your own life and your role as a citizen. What small act of courage will you choose today? What will you do to defend freedom, build community, and create a more just and humane world?
Until next time, keep diving deep.